Thank you, Bronwyn, and good evening, everyone. I was a NATO official in Moscow in the mid-1990s. And let me tell you, I had many discussions with the Russian side about NATO enlargement, the purpose of the alliance. And I can tell you this, that there's a danger in taking the Russian arguments at face value, because they very frequently contain half-truths. And we just had one half-truth there about the coup in 2014 in Ukraine. In my view, there was only one coup in 2014 in Ukraine, and it was in Crimea. So we haven't got time to go into these things, but one has to be very, very cautious with what the Russians say. I remember also in 2004, President Putin said when the Baltic states joined NATO that Russia didn't like it, but countries are free to make their choices. This had a great effect on the Germans, by the way. They thought, yes, Putin is actually on board now, which was, of course, an error, but it was interesting that the young Russian president at the time said that. I believe I'm probably not alone in this room in regarding this motion in some way as disrespectful, and I would say even insulting, to millions of Ukrainian citizens. Those citizens who, well before the start of the big war, had shown their allegiance to an independent Ukraine, and one free to choose its own destiny, because their choice is what provoked Russia and what provoked Putin personally. And as Laurie has said, the catalyst for this was in 2004. It was the Orange Revolution. Millions of people went onto the streets to signal to the Kremlin that Ukraine was an independent country capable of electing its own leaders without guidance or indeed interference from Moscow. Putin was shocked and humiliated by his miscalculation that he could simply shoehorn Viktor Yanukovych into the presidency. So the desire of Ukrainians for their country to develop along European lines and not on the template of Putin's Russia was the trigger, in my view, for the invasions of 2014 and 2022. It was this Ukrainian defiance that pushed Putin over the edge and persuaded him to intervene. Now, of course, it's fair to say that Western institutions and the Western way of life were undoubtedly magnets in this process. But this is entirely different from claiming that Western policy provoked the Russian bear into taking such an extreme step and made it attack the people it supposedly regarded as fraternal. The fact is that the Putin regime increasingly made Russia unappealing to millions of Ukrainians who were in fact previously well disposed to Russia and Russians and saw the countries as closely related. And by contrast, Europe exerted the force of attraction. Now Putin, if you analyse this, he has an absolutely terrible record of reading Ukraine over the past 25 years. He's clung consistently to this idea that the Ukrainians are really Russians who are simply in denial about their identity because of the flawed nationality policies of the Bolsheviks. He just can't get away from this. In 1991, formally, Russia recognized Ukraine's independence. But it was clearly from the early 1990s that there was a strong consensus in Moscow that Ukraine, like other CIS countries, continued in some way to belong to the Russia. And in the case of Ukraine, it was the depth of the historical relationship, the shared borders, the highly integrated economies, of course, and the millions of intermarriages that made it really inconceivable for the Russian elite that there could ever be a fundamental break with Ukraine. This was not a genuine acceptance of Ukrainian independence. And we saw tentatively under Ukraine's second president, Leonid Kuchma, the difference in political culture started to emerge. Ukraine's instinctive desire for freedom, a certain degree of chaos, one might say, their discomfort with strong centralized rule that they associated with foreigners. This encouraged the rapid and very rapid development of civil society in Ukraine. And at the same time, the differences between the west and the east of the country were becoming more visible as society in Ukraine desovietized at different speeds. And this was something the Russians would later play on when they took up the mantle of defending Russian speakers in Donbass. Political processes were running in separate directions in Russia and Ukraine, making a collision of interests, in my view, inevitable. Russia was becoming more repressive, as Tony was there, as the Putin system really cemented its rule. And meanwhile, Ukraine was becoming freer and society was developing a voice. And the Orange Revolution was a stunning manifestation of this. The power of the street deeply scared the Kremlin. After all, Ukrainians and Russians in the Russian mind were one people, so it's possible this could happen in Russia as well. And it did. In late 2011, after Putin announced his intention to return to the presidency. These were by far the biggest protests that have been seen under Putin's rule, and they were driven by opposition parties demanding free and fair elections, not dissimilar to 2004 in Ukraine. The authorities held their own anti-orange protests. And I think this was the first real indication that the Kremlin saw that Ukraine had potential to become what they later called, and to this day call, anti-Russia. And by this they really mean a democratic alternative to the Putin model of governance, and therefore a threat to it. The annexation of Crimea and Russia's establishment of two separatist regimes in Donbass, they simply galvanized the process of Ukrainianization. This was not at root an issue of language, it was one of identity and values. You could be Ukrainian and you could speak Russian as your preferred language. But by rejecting Russia's veto on their desire to move closer to the EU, Ukrainians showed that they were not prepared to be simply subsumed into Putin's backward-looking Russian world. They didn't see the future there. The rest is history, and I dwell on this because what I find disturbing in the positions of those who argue the case of our opponents here is that they tend to treat Ukraine and its citizens as objects rather than the subjects of policy. They want us to believe that Ukrainians are destined to take orders from Moscow because Russia is entitled to a zone of influence on its borders. This is the primary cause of the war. And if Ukrainians were happy to be a buffer state, subservient to Russia, then in this argument there would be no war. And this old thinking, I would suggest, is actually quite widespread. And I cannot resist quoting a letter of the Financial Times by one Tony Brenton in 2014. Days before Russia occupied Crimea, Tony dismissed the possibility of Russian military intervention and called it a dark fantasy. So 10 days later, Tony wrote to the Financial Times again to apologize for his error, and I'm struck by the words of that second letter. Tony wrote the following: "It will be argued that Russia's action is a throwback to a now extinct era of hard power. I'm afraid it's always been a fond delusion that great power politics today operate any differently from in all previous times. Thucydides is right." Now, for me, personally, to accept this argument in Europe requires jettisoning the belief in the core principles of European security embedded in the Helsinki Final Act and the Charter of Paris, signed by one Gorbachev, by the way. As Europeans, Ukrainians are gravely challenging the notion that might is right in international affairs. I am personally in no doubt that they will eventually prevail because they are morally right. Ukraine will preserve its independence and it will find a path to becoming a full member of the European family. But in the meantime, let there be no confusion about the cause of the war.